She said she locked it, but someone else walked through. Welcome to Tea and Clues. I am your host, Daxon. Help build this sleuthing circle. Comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. You make this space feel like home. Let's start. It was the kind of late summer afternoon that seemed to have been plucked from the pages of a glossy magazine. Sunlight dappled through the oaks. The tea was served precisely at 4, and the ladies of St. Justin the Wold had gathered in the manicured garden of Mrs. Edith Banbury for the annual Women's Institute garden party. Miss Jane Marple, sitting near the ornamental fountain with a plate of seed cake balanced delicately on her lap, sipped her tea and nodded politely as Mrs. Weatherby recounted, for the third time, that afternoon, how she had once met the Duke of Gloucester at a flower show in Cheltenham. All was comfortingly familiar. There were rose-trimmed hats, linen dresses, and the murmur of polite conversation. The scent of lavender mingled with the heavier sweetness of Victoria sponge, and the vicar's wife was once again trying to explain why the bunting hadn't matched this year's colour theme. One might have thought evil could never intrude upon such a placid corner of the world, but of course Miss Marple knew better. It began with a scream, sharp, shocked, and utterly out of place. The sort of scream that slices through the chintz and china of an English garden party like a butcher's knife. The guests turned in unison, teacups frozen in mid-air. The scream had come from the house. In moments everyone was on their feet, bustling toward the source of the noise with a mixture of alarm and poorly disguised curiosity. Miss Marple, though she appeared unhurried, was among the first to reach the French doors that led into the rear drawing-room of Thornfield House. There, standing as if rooted to the Persian rug, was Mrs. Edith Banbury's housekeeper, Mrs. Flora Humphreys. Her hand was still clutched to her mouth, eyes wild with disbelief. Just behind her, sprawled across the polished floor, lay the body of Mr. Felix Carow. Mr. Carow, a solicitor recently retired from London, had moved into the village only 6 months ago. He was neither universally liked nor overtly disliked, merely tolerated, as incomers often are. He had taken a lease on Honeysuckle Cottage and was said to be keeping to himself, though it was also said he had an eye for the vicar's niece and a sour word for the grocer's prices. "Good heavens," murmured Mrs. Weatherby, clutching her pearls. "He looks, oh dear, he's gone quite blue." Dr. Edgeworth, summoned from the croquet lawn with his napkin still tucked into his collar, knelt beside the fallen man. After a moment he looked up and pronounced the words all present had both expected and dreaded. "I'm afraid he's quite dead." Someone gasped. Someone else dropped a teacup. Miss Marple, ever precise, adjusted the rim of her hat. "Mrs. Humphreys," she said gently, "perhaps you could tell us what happened." The housekeeper swallowed. I'd just come in to fetch the ice bucket, the one from the back pantry. The back door was locked, though I always leave it ajar during the garden party in case of deliveries. It struck me as odd, but I thought perhaps Cook had closed it without thinking. Then I walked in here and her. Voice failed her, and she looked down at the corpse, horrified. Detective Inspector Graves arrived within the hour, summoned from nearby Downford by telephone. A stout, brisk man with a neat moustache and a permanent squint of suspicion, he took immediate charge. He asked questions. He took names. He began scribbling furiously into his notebook. It was all very official, very proper. Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner chair, her knitting in her lap, though she'd done little more than shift the needles since the commotion began. Her eyes, however, moved constantly, taking in the room, the guests, the housekeeper's trembling hands, and Mrs. Banbury's suspiciously red-rimmed eyes. "Locked back door, eh?" Graves muttered. "Odd. Someone wanted to be sure no one came in the wrong way." But Miss Marple was not looking at the door. She was watching Mrs. Humphreys's shoes, scuffed, but with a faint trace of cream-coloured frosting on the right heel. And it was then, perhaps, that the very first quiet thread of suspicion began to take form in her mind. By the following morning, the tidy village of St. Just in the Wold was a nest of speculation, buzzing like a disturbed beehive. Mrs. Weatherby had made it her personal mission to recount the entire affair, twice in fact before breakfast, first to the grocer's wife and then again to the milkman, with only the slightest embellishments. "I was just a yard away, you know, just a yard, when poor Mrs. Humphreys let out that terrible scream. Of course I knew immediately something dreadful had happened. My nerves have always been finely attuned to these things." At the post office, Miss Hartley and Mr. Forbes, who normally disagreed on everything from postal rates to political matters, were united in their shared belief that London types always brought trouble with them. Mr. Felix Carrow, they agreed, had had a look about him. "He never said much," muttered Mr. Forbes, sorting stamps with excessive force. "That's the dangerous sort, not like village folk. Keeps things to himself. And he was nosy, asked about everyone." "Didn't he once argue with that boy from the council about a fence?" asked Miss Hartley. "And didn't Mrs. Banbury's cook say he used to take photographs of the lane behind the church? Not natural, that." The particulars of the murder were still fuzzy. The police had not released much to the public. All anyone knew was that Mr. Carrow had been found dead in Mrs. Banbury's drawing room, that the back door had been locked. Very odd, said everyone. And that the housekeeper, poor woman, had nearly collapsed on the spot. Down at the Green Parrot Tea Room, the village's social hub and preferred venue for lower-key gossip, speculation had turned toward the housekeeper herself. "She found the body, didn't she?" said Lily Pratchett, who worked behind the counter. "Always the one who finds it, I say. Too much of a coincidence." Her companion, Dotty Green, lowered her voice conspiratorially. "She's a stern one, that Flora Humphreys. I heard from my cousin, she cleans over at Thornfield House on Fridays, that Mrs. Humphreys didn't take kindly to Mr. Carrow being invited for tea by Mrs. Banbury. Said it wasn't right, him showing up so often. Thought he was looking to become more familiar than proper." That's the phrase she used. Jealous, maybe. Or protective. Who knows what kind of arrangement they had. He wasn't bad-looking, not if you squinted a bit. Miss Marple, sitting quietly at the far end of the room with her embroidery, overheard much of this without drawing attention to herself. She rarely needed to ask questions. People simply spoke more freely when they believed she wasn't really listening. She observed that people tended to fill gaps in knowledge with imagination, which was, in its own way, quite telling. Lies were bold and self-serving. Gossip, on the other hand, revealed people's fears and prejudices. Still, not all the village chatter was idle. A few truths slipped through, particularly when the speaker wasn't aware they'd said anything important. For instance, Mrs. Pratchett mentioned that Mrs. Banbury had received a parcel that very morning, hand-delivered by bicycle from Downford. "Brown paper and string," she said knowingly, and her face went white as milk when she saw it. Later, Miss Marple happened to mention this in passing to Reverend Archibald Mayhew as they passed in the churchyard. "Curious," he said thoughtfully, "especially as she's refused to see visitors all day. I called round just after luncheon, purely pastoral, of course, and was told she had a headache." He glanced toward the rectory's rose beds, unusually subdued. "Not like Edith. She's never missed the altar guild meeting, not even when she had shingles." Miss Marple nodded. "Shock affects people differently, of course, but if I may say so, headaches that arrive with parcels are rarely the sort prescribed by doctors." The Reverend looked startled but said nothing. Meanwhile, the police investigation had settled into the kind of careful procedural rhythm typical of Inspector Graves. He was not an imaginative man, but he was a thorough one, and had already interviewed most of the party guests. Several lines of inquiry had emerged. Mr. Carrow's cause of death, it appeared, was poisoning, arsenic to be exact, introduced into a cup of tea. The doctor had found enough in the remaining dregs to fell a horse. Of course, this raised complications. Tea had been served from a shared pot, poured out by Mrs. Banbury's maid. Yet Mr. Carrow's cup alone had been tampered with. It suggested premeditation and access. Someone must have slipped it in, Graves had told his constable. Into his cup specifically. That means they either knew which one he'd be handed, or gave it to him themselves. The maid, a nervous girl named Elsie, insisted she'd served everyone randomly. "I just poured from left to right, sir, just the same as always. I didn't know whose cup was whose." Honest? Graves was not convinced, but he was far more interested in Mrs. Humphreys. After all, she'd discovered the body. She had access to the kitchen, and, significantly, she had locked the back door, which might have prevented a quick escape. Except Mrs. Humphreys swore she hadn't touched the door at all. "I found it locked, sir, and that struck me as peculiar. I'd left it open earlier in the day." Graves had scowled, but he'd written it down, and he had taken possession of the teacups and silver tray for inspection. Not that he believed they'd reveal much. Miss Marple, watching the investigation proceed from the sidelines, kept her thoughts to herself. She'd taken note of several things. Firstly, that Mrs. Humphreys, while clearly shaken, seemed not at all defensive when asked about the door. That might suggest she was telling the truth, or that she was a very good liar. Secondly, that Mrs. Banbury had not cried. Not truly. She had dabbed at her eyes, certainly, and her voice had wavered, but her composure had never cracked, which was odd if one assumed she'd found Mr. Carrow charming company. And thirdly, there was the matter of the frosting. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone yet, but she had definitely seen the smudge on Mrs. Humphreys's heel, and it matched the remains of the lemon cake that had been served just prior to the murder. Miss Marple had known, from many years of observing housemaids and garden party arrangements, that the housekeeper rarely passed through the tea tent during service, unless something had gone wrong. She would find out what that something was. Quietly, politely, and without disturbing anyone unnecessarily. Back in her sitting room that evening, Miss Marple took out a small notepad and made a list, not of suspects, though she had some ideas, but of behaviors. Who had spoken too quickly? Who had spoken too little? Who had offered explanations no one had asked for? She underlined 3 names and paused. Then, with deliberate care, she wrote a 4th. Mrs. Banbury. Received mysterious parcel post-murder. Connection to Mr. Carrow. She tapped the pen against her chin thoughtfully. Somewhere in the quiet lanes of St. Just-in-the-Wold, a murderer was still among them. And Miss Marple, knitting basket at her side and an unassuming expression on her face, was beginning to tug gently at the threads of deception. By Tuesday morning, the village had grown weary of its own gossip and speculation. Talk of arsenic had sobered even the most enthusiastic tongues, and a general air of unease had settled over St. Just-in-the-Wold. Children were kept indoors, and shopkeepers lowered their voices when strangers entered. The women of the church postponed the Thursday bake sale out of a kind of moral instinct, as though lemon drizzle and murder simply didn't mix. At Thornfield House, Mrs. Banbury remained out of sight. The curtains in the upper rooms were drawn, and a discreet sign on the gatepost read, "No visitors, police inquiries ongoing." Yet Miss Marple had long understood that discretion rarely equated to privacy. In a village such as theirs, one's life could be known in great detail without a single soul ever being invited indoors. Miss Marple took her investigations in small steps. She began quite naturally with a visit to Mr. Carrow's modest home at Honeysuckle Cottage, under the guise of calling on Mrs. Lem, his housekeeper. Mrs. Lem had served the late Mr. Carrow for a brief 3 months, and her opinions were well formed. A strange man, she told Miss Marple while drying a teacup. Very particular about things. Sugar in jars, socks folded just so, and always asking questions, odd questions. Not about the house or the village, mind you. About people. Always people. People? Miss Marple asked, her tone as mild as warm milk. He'd ask about Mr. Peebles and his late wife, and about that girl at the greengrocer's who lost her mother during the war. He even asked about the vicar's first sermon, before he came here, as though he was putting together a puzzle we weren't aware existed. Miss Marple didn't blink. Did he ever say why he wanted to know these things? No, said Mrs. Lem with a sniff. He just listened, and he wrote things down in a notebook. Always that notebook. This pricked Miss Marple's interest. Do. You know where the notebook is now? She asked gently. No idea, said Mrs. Lem. Police took his papers, I expect. Or maybe it's still in his study. Neatly kept it was, everything had its place. Miss Marple left shortly after, thanking Mrs. Lem and tucking the small detail of the missing notebook into her mental basket of useful oddities. It was, she believed, often the things that vanished rather than appeared which held the most meaning. Later that day, she passed Inspector Graves on the high street, pacing outside the butcher's with his usual scowl. He tipped his hat and she returned the courtesy, pausing briefly. You must be quite overrun with theories, she said sweetly. Graves huffed. I've had half the village trying to solve this case. Most of them believe it was the housekeeper, Mrs. Humphreys. A good number suspect Mrs. Banbury. A few even blame the vicar's niece, though I can't for the life of me see why. Miss Felicity, said Miss Marple. A charming girl, perhaps too charming for some tastes. The inspector gave her a sidelong look. Do you have a theory, Miss Marple? Oh, no, dear, she said with a gentle smile. I never theorize. I simply listen. With that she continued on her way, leaving Graves to mutter into his collar. But Miss Marple was doing far more than listening. She was observing subtle things, quiet things, things no one else considered important. Like how Mr. Jenkins, the grocer, had suddenly removed a photograph from his counter, a holiday snap with Mr. Carrow from a village cycling club event, or how Miss Felicity had developed a sudden, dramatic interest in the church's youth choir, to avoid questions. And then there was the matter of Mrs. Banbury's parcel. The police had not made it public, but Miss Marple had ways of learning things that did not involve breaking and entering or bribery. Mr. Sims, the young postboy, was a great admirer of Miss Marple's rose garden, and had once confided in her about his fear of dogs. He now found himself telling her, quite unprompted, that Mrs. Banbury's mysterious parcel had no return address and had been posted from London second class, wrapped in brown paper and twine. I remember, 'cause it smelled odd, he added. Like liniment and boot polish, not perfume like most of hers do. Curious, Miss Marple had replied mildly. And did she say anything when she opened it? Oh, she didn't open it in front of me, miss. She near snatched it from my hands, slammed the door straight after. Didn't say thank you. Miss Marple thanked him in kind, with a slice of currant loaf and a gentle inquiry about his new puppy, then returned home to consider what she had learned. That evening she received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Humphreys, the housekeeper, stood on Miss Marple's doorstep, pale and composed, holding a folded shawl with mechanical precision. I hoped I might speak to you, Miss Marple, she said quietly. Privately. Miss Marple stepped aside and led her into the parlour, offering a seat near the fire. She made no pretense of surprise. People often came to her when trouble touched them. It was the curious gift of her reputation. Even when unspoken, it drew truth like a magnet. Mrs. Humphreys sat stiffly. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the hem of her skirt. I've worked for Mrs. Banbury for 20 years, she said, after a long pause. Since her late husband passed, I run that house as clean and proper as a church altar. I never allowed strangers to linger in rooms unattended, and I certainly never locked doors without cause. I believe you, said Miss Marple gently. Please go on. The housekeeper's eyes welled slightly. I didn't like Mr. Carrow, there I said it. Something about him, it wasn't just that he was nosy. It was the way he'd smile when you spoke, like he already knew what you were going to say and was just waiting to catch you in it. Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. He had too many questions. About Mrs. Banbury, about her family, about the way things were done in that house. Did Mrs. Banbury confide in him? Miss Marple asked. I'm not sure, but she was fond of him. Too fond, perhaps. He made her laugh. That was rare. She was different around him. Miss Marple let silence do its work. Finally, Mrs. Humphreys added, I think he had something on her, something he knew, and whatever was in that parcel she received, it frightened her. I saw her hands shake when she read the note. What note? Mrs. Humphreys blinked. It was inside the parcel, a letter or a scrap of paper. She burned it straight away in the fireplace. I saw the ashes. This Miss Marple did not comment on. She simply rose and offered the woman a second cup of tea. You've done the right thing, Mrs. Humphreys. Sometimes justice begins not with answers, but with the courage to say what no one else will. The housekeeper looked relieved, if only slightly. As she left, Miss Marple returned to her notepad and wrote a single phrase beneath her growing list of peculiarities. Mrs. Banbury received a letter. Burned it. Why? She stared at the words for a long time before adding one more. Blackmail. Outside, the wind rustled in the hedges, and the church bells marked the hour. Miss Marple folded her hands, her eyes sharp beneath the softness of her white curls. The web was beginning to take shape. Inspector Graves was not a man given to flights of fancy. He had a great deal of respect for rules, proper shoes, and the well-timed application of pressure during interviews. To him, murder was rarely a matter of complex psychology or tangled histories. It was a matter of opportunity, access, and motive. The rest was dressing, and in this case the suspect who made the most sense remained Mrs. Flora Humphreys. She had discovered the body. She had access to the kitchen. She had been protective of her employer, and might have resented Mr. Carrow's growing closeness with Mrs. Banbury. And though she was a woman of good standing, long service, and no criminal history, Graves was untroubled by the idea that even those with clean records could commit unclean deeds. But there was no direct evidence against her, and worse, Miss Marple, who had not yet said a word to him about the case, had recently been seen having tea with the woman, her expression characteristically serene. Graves did not consider himself superstitious, but when Miss Marple took tea with someone, they were either innocent or very soon to be caught in a lie. So, when he received word that Mrs. Banbury had finally agreed to speak with him, he went to Thornfield House with a sense of purpose. She met him in the small library, a tidy, dim room that smelled of lemon oil and old paper. She looked paler than usual, but wore her customary twinset and pearls. Her hands, however, trembled slightly as she poured the tea. "Inspector," she said, "I do hope this won't take long. I've barely slept, and the headaches—" He gave a respectful nod. "Of course, ma'am. Just a few clarifications. We're narrowing the timeline. I want to be sure we haven't missed anything." Mrs. Banbury offered a tight smile. "There's little I can tell you that I haven't already told your constable. Humor me." He asked the usual questions. Where she was during the time of death, mingling among the garden party guests, who had access to the drawing room, technically everyone, as the house was open to accommodate the gathering. Whether Mr. Carrow had any enemies, she couldn't imagine it. Graves leaned in slightly. "And you were fond of him?" She hesitated. "He was intriguing, good company, sharp in a way that was refreshing. But we were hardly intimate." "Certainly not." Her tone was clipped. "St. Just-in-the-Wold is not London. Inspector, one does not entertain men in one's home with any suggestion of impropriety." He let that lie where it landed, then produced a small photograph. "Do you recognize this man?" Mrs. Banbury's teacup rattled against the saucer. She recovered quickly, but not before Graves saw the flicker of something sharp in her eyes. "No," she said. Why do you ask? He was seen speaking with Mr. Carrow outside the post office a week before the murder. Animatedly. Some might say aggressively. Then you'll have to ask Mr. Carrow. Oh, of course, you can't. The barb was clear, and Graves registered it silently. But Miss Marple that very same afternoon took a different tack entirely. She had decided to pay a call on the vicar's niece, Felicity Mayhew, ostensibly to discuss a knitting drive for the Orphans Fund, but in truth, because Miss Felicity had been avoiding public attention with all the grace of a guilty conscience. Felicity lived with her uncle in the rectory, a charming, ivy-covered house beside the church. She met Miss Marple at the door, cheeks flushed and eyes a little too bright. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, "what a surprise. Do come in." They sat in the parlour, a room filled with floral upholstery and half-finished crochet projects. Miss Marple complimented the girl's stitching and asked very gently how she'd been managing since the dreadful incident. Felicity gave a wan smile. "It's all anyone talks about. I feel dreadfully rude, but I haven't had the strength to see people. I didn't even know Mr. Carrow that well." "Really?" said Miss Marple, selecting a sugar lump for her tea. "That surprises me. I had the impression you were quite friendly." Felicity blinked. "We spoke occasionally, but nothing more." "And yet," Miss Marple said, stirring delicately, "I happened to notice that you weren't surprised. When the scream came, I mean, you didn't react like the others." Felicity flushed. "That's not fair." "Oh, no, my dear, I'm sure it's not. Life very rarely is." There was a pause. Then Felicity said in a low voice, "He asked me questions about Uncle, about Mother, about—" She hesitated. "About something that happened before I came to live here. He was looking into things." "Things?" Miss Marple echoed, keeping her tone neutral. Felicity hesitated again. "He thought someone in the village had done something. Years ago. A mistake, he called it. Said it had been covered up." "Miss—" Marple's eyes didn't waver. "And did he tell you what this mistake was?" "No, just that it involved a death or a disappearance, something like that. He wouldn't say who." The girl looked up, anguish flickering in her expression. "I thought he was writing a book, a mystery novel perhaps. But then he started asking more and more, like he was putting pressure on people. I saw him and Mrs. Banbury in the churchyard one evening. They were arguing." Miss Marple filed this away. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because—" Felicity broke off. "Because I didn't know what was real and what wasn't, and now he's dead." Miss Marple reached out and patted the girl's hand. "You've done well to share this now, dear. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how long it's been buried." She left the rectory with much on her mind. It was becoming increasingly clear that Mr. Carrow had not simply been a reclusive solicitor seeking peace and quiet. He had come to St. Just-in-the-Wold with a purpose, perhaps even a vendetta. But whom had he targeted, and what was the long-ago mistake he intended to unearth? That evening, Miss Marple paid one final visit to the village cemetery. She walked between the mossy gravestones as the dusk settled in, her steps slow and measured. She stopped at a weathered plot, one few visited now. The headstone read, "Margaret Ellis, 1906-1948. Beloved daughter and sister." Too soon. There was no family left in the village. Margaret Ellis had drowned in the river nearly 30 years ago, an accident according to the report. But Miss Marple remembered the whispers at the time. She had been a maid, working for the Banburys. She also remembered quite clearly that Flora Humphreys had been in the household even then. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. Was Mr. Carrow here to uncover a forgotten tragedy? Had he discovered something about the death of Margaret Ellis? And if so, who would kill to keep it hidden? She stood in silence for a moment longer. Then, just before leaving, she bent down and brushed the leaves from the grave. The days after Mr. Carrow's murder had grown dimmer and quieter in St. Just-in-the-Wold, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Even the birds in the hedgerows seemed less inclined to sing. Rain fell on the Wednesday, soft, misting rain that turned garden paths to mush and kept most indoors. For Miss Marple, it was the perfect sort of weather for reflection. She sat in her drawing-room, fire gently crackling and a ball of pale blue yarn in her lap, untouched. Her thoughts were far from crochet. She had just come from a brief but important call at the village library, where a curious bit of information had fallen into her lap, quite literally. Miss Daphne Greening, the librarian, had been shelving old parish bulletins when a thin envelope slipped from the pages of the 1948 Harvest Festival program. She had called to Miss Marple, who often stopped by for the latest gardening almanac, and handed it over with a puzzled look. Inside was a brittle page torn from a notebook. On it, in tight, precise handwriting, was the beginning of a list. Ellis. Margaret, maid at Thornfield House, drowned autumn 48. Accidental. Smythe Harold Gardner, dismissed suddenly same year. F.H. continued in service. Why? Find coroner's report? Note. Banbury's sister. Unrecorded visit that week. Miss Marple had scanned the page once, then folded it with care, and tucked it into her handbag. Now warm and dry at home, she examined it more closely. The initials F.H. clearly pointed to Flora Humphreys, and the handwriting, she now realized with certainty, matched that of a receipt she had seen in Mr. Carrow's study. This page was part of his notes, perhaps the very notebook Mrs. Lem had spoken of. But why had it ended up in a church program decades old? That question remained unanswered, but what mattered more was that Mr. Carrow had been investigating a death long buried in time. Margaret Ellis's drowning had been dismissed as a tragic accident. A young servant girl, walking home alone in... The fog had slipped and fallen into the river. No scandal, no suspicion, but Mr. Carrow had not believed it. And now it seemed neither did Miss Marple. She rang up the county archives in Downford and requested a copy of the coroner's inquest. The clerk, a chatty sort named Mr. Gibbons, agreed to send it along the next day, but before hanging up he made an odd remark. "You're not the first to ask about that one, Miss Marple. Fellow from London, solicitor, I think, came asking, a few months back. Never said why. Seemed quite interested in who was still living from that household." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the receiver. Did he leave a name? Carrow, I believe. Yes, that's right. So, the mystery unfolded a little more. That evening, Miss Marple visited her old friend Miss Lavinia Pike, once the daughter, of Thornfield House's former head groom. Lavinia, now in her 70s, lived alone with a Siamese cat and a collection of pressed flower albums. They spoke of many things, rain, mildew, old recipes, but eventually Miss Marple guided the conversation to the autumn of 1948. "Oh, Margaret Ellis," Lavinia said, her voice softening. "Such a quiet girl, kept to herself. I always thought there was more to it than they said. The river's a ways off the path, you see. One doesn't simply fall in without some persuasion." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Was there anyone she had troubles with?" "Well, the gardener, Harold Smythe, had a temper," Lavinia said. "Used to shout at the staff when he'd had too much cider, but he was sacked not long before Margaret died. Some row over tools, if I recall." "And Flora Humphreys?" Miss Marple asked. Lavinia frowned. Always kept herself separate. She was different then, younger, but already with that stiff look. "I once caught her warning Margaret not to step out of line. I didn't think much of it at the time." Miss Marple nodded slowly. A pattern was emerging. Not yet a full picture, but shapes, outlines, beginnings. Then came the most surprising discovery of all. It happened quite by chance. On Thursday morning, Miss Marple called into the dressmaker's, Mrs. Tilling's shop, for a few alterations. While waiting, she struck up a conversation with Miss Emily Drayton, a quiet woman who worked part-time there and had once served as Mrs. Banbury's personal secretary. Miss Drayton, always eager to share the unappreciated details of her former work. Mentioned something curious. "I was once asked to destroy a stack of old letters," she said. "Mrs. Banbury gave them to me herself, told me they were from a family friend who had embarrassed her. This was maybe 10, 12 years ago." Miss Marple looked up from her thread sample. "Do you remember the name?" "I do. I shouldn't. But I do. Margaret Ellis." Miss Marple's hands paused, motionless. "She told you to burn them." "Yes, but I didn't. I couldn't. I thought maybe they were love letters, secret, that sort of thing. But they weren't. They were odd. One of them said Margaret was frightened, that someone had threatened her. She didn't say who, but she wrote something like, 'They said they'd tell Mrs. Banbury what I heard behind the drawing-room door.' I found it chilling. Do you still have them?" I think so. They're at home. I hid them in the back of my sewing drawer." Miss Marple pressed her hand gently. "Would you let me see them?" Miss Drayton nodded. "I'll bring them this afternoon." She did. There were 4 letters, 2 short, one stained with what looked like tears. They spoke of someone in the house who frightened Margaret, of something she heard, possibly an argument, a secret, and the final one ended abruptly, as though it had been interrupted. Miss Marple read them all without expression, then handed them back. Later that day, a small gathering of villagers met outside the church to prepare for the rescheduled bake sale. Miss Marple joined them, smiling pleasantly, her hands folded over her handbag. She spoke to everyone, casually, gently. She asked Mrs. Weatherby if she remembered who had fetched the tea that day. She asked Elsie, the maid, about the serving tray and the cups. "Oh, yes," Elsie said. "I had to replace one. One of the cups had a chip in the rim. Miss Felicity noticed and told me to switch it." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And where did you get the replacement?" "From the kitchen cupboard." "Did you clean it first?" "No. It was already washed, just sitting upside down near the sink." Miss Marple smiled and thanked her. But inside her mind, the mechanism clicked into place. A clean cup already out, not among the others, which meant someone had prepared it separately. And if someone had known in advance that Mr. Carrow would receive that very cup, she walked slowly home that evening, the first edge of clarity pressing through the fog. Someone had orchestrated the tea service with care. Someone had ensured that a particular cup would find its way into Mr. Carrow's hands. Someone who had once silenced a frightened maid and now needed to silence a solicitor who'd come too close to the truth. She opened her front gate and paused before stepping inside. A small blackbird fluttered to a nearby branch. Miss Marple smiled, faintly. She knew now what the next step must be. By Friday morning, the hush over St. Just in the Wold had taken on a more brittle quality, like glass stretched thin. There were too many whispers behind closed doors, too many half-finished sentences in shop queues, and too many glances darted across teacups. Miss Marple noticed it, especially in the way people reacted to each other rather than to the crime itself. It wasn't fear of the murderer that had them on edge. It was fear of exposure. In small villages, people lived with their secrets the way one might live with a bad joint or a creaky stair, quietly, privately, never thinking the world might look too closely. But now, with Mr. Carrow's death dredging up names and dates that many had long since buried, the past was stirring. And it made people anxious. Miss Marple, in her methodical and deceptively gentle way, began visiting houses, under entirely innocent pretenses. At the cottage of Harold Smythe, now long retired and practically reclusive, she brought a tin of shortbread and asked after his rheumatism. Smythe, a grizzled, red-faced man with a permanent sneer, was not pleased to see her but tolerated the visit. She waited until the second cup of tea. "I passed poor Margaret Ellis's grave yesterday," she said softly, as though in passing. Smythe froze, his thick fingers tightening around his chipped mug. She was a quiet girl, Miss Marple went on. Worked hard, kept to herself. He said nothing. She was dismissed from Thornfield House just before her death, wasn't she? No idea, he muttered. I wasn't there long enough to remember. But you were there. At the same time, she was. When she died. He stood abruptly. I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple, but I've no time for this. I've said all I had to say to the inspector. I'm sure you did, she replied calmly, rising. Though I expect the truth has a habit of surviving even the most determined silence. She left him red-faced and fuming, but not before she'd seen his hand tremble when he reached for the kettle. It wasn't guilt, not exactly, it was fear. Not of being accused, but of something coming to light. Later that afternoon she took a turn through the village green and encountered Miss Felicity Mayhew, distracted, pale, and clearly agitated. Miss Marple, she said, stopping awkwardly. I was hoping to run into you. How fortunate, Miss Marple said gently. Are you quite well, my dear? Felicity hesitated. There's something I haven't told the inspector, something I remembered, or perhaps didn't want to remember, but I think it matters. They found a bench under the old oak tree where the bees buzzed lazily, and the scent of honeysuckle drifted faintly in the breeze. It's about the day of the party, Felicity said. I'd gone indoors to fetch a shawl for Aunt Edith. I passed the drawing room just before the scream. Miss Marple listened without interruption. I saw someone inside, just briefly. They weren't meant to be there. Who? Felicity's voice lowered. Mrs. Humphreys. She was near the tea tray. She had a cloth in her hand and seemed to be adjusting one of the cups. Are you sure it was Mrs. Humphreys? Yes. She had her cap on, and she always moves a certain way, carefully, like she's measuring her steps. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, why didn't you say this before? I thought I was mistaken, and she looked upset. Not like she'd done something to the tea, but like she'd just seen something terrible. Miss Marple placed her gloved hand gently on Felicity's. You've been brave to say this. Sometimes our memories hide things to protect us, but the truth always asks to be seen. Miss Marple knew the implication. If Mrs. Humphreys had been near the tea tray just before the murder, the police would see it as damning. But Miss Marple didn't believe the housekeeper had poisoned Mr. Carrow. No, if anything, the woman had walked in on something she wasn't meant to witness, something or someone that frightened her into silence. That evening, Miss Marple returned home to find a note slipped under her door. I need to speak with you. It's time. Edie Emily Drayton. She arrived just past 7, breathless and anxious, carrying a sealed envelope. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore, Emily said. I reread the letters. One of them, Margaret's final one, mentions a name. It's faint in pencil, almost rubbed out. I didn't see it before. She handed the envelope to Miss Marple, who opened it with care. Inside was a page torn from a cheap writing pad. The handwriting was rushed, looping. At the bottom, barely legible, were the words, "And if anything happens to me, tell Mrs. Banbury it was The rest was smudged. H, Miss Marple murmured. Too vague. But there's something else, Emily said. I remembered something odd, about the morning before Margaret died. I was helping Mrs. Banbury arrange her jewellery. She was preparing for a charity ball, and I overheard a raised voice in the drawing room. I didn't recognize it at the time, but I'm almost certain now it was Margaret. She was shouting at someone, saying, "You can't pretend you don't know what I heard." Miss Marple looked up sharply. Did Mrs. Banbury hear? I think she did, but she never asked about it. Just closed the box and told me she'd changed her mind about attending. This confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion. Margaret. Ellis had discovered something in Thornfield House, something scandalous, something dangerous, and it hadn't been forgotten, it had been buried. And now Mr. Carrow had tried to unearth it. The final confrontation of the evening came unexpectedly. Just before 8, Miss Marple heard a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Banbury. She looked less composed than usual, her hair less tidy, her brooch askew. "I came," she said without preamble, "because I know you've been asking questions." Miss Marple gestured her inside, calm as ever. "I've asked nothing that didn't already want answering," she said. Mrs. Banbury sank into the nearest chair. "I know what you think, that I'm hiding something. And I am. But not what you. Suspect I didn't kill Felix Caro." Miss Marple waited. "He came to me with questions about the past, about Margaret Ellis. He thought I'd covered something up. He said he had proof." "Did he?" "No," she said bitterly. "Only suspicions. Margaret did overhear something once, an argument between my sister and someone else. But it had nothing to do with her death. She was a troubled girl. She drank, you know. The staff never said anything, but I found bottles." Miss Marple said very quietly, "You think she fell?" Mrs. Banbury looked away. "I hope she did." The silence stretched between them. "Mr. Caro threatened to go public," Mrs. Banbury said. "Not because he wanted justice, because he wanted to blackmail me. He never said it outright, but I knew." "Did you tell anyone?" "I told Mrs. Humphreys. She's been with me since the beginning. She's the only one I trusted." Miss Marple rose, her face unreadable. "Then it seems, my dear," she said softly, "that someone else heard more than you thought." As Mrs. Banbury left, the shadows deepened in the sitting room. Miss Marple remained by the window, watching. The moon rise above the thatched rooftops. The secrets were surfacing now. Half-buried truths, warped by years of silence. But she still didn't know who had poisoned the tea. Not yet. Saturday dawned cold and clear, the sort of autumn morning that painted the village in soft gold and long shadows. It was the kind of weather that gave one the illusion of peace, crisp, still honest. But in St. Just in the Wold, peace had become a performance, and somewhere beneath the polite smiles and brisk morning errands, the murderer was watching, waiting. Miss Marple had risen early, compelled by something she couldn't quite name. A shift, perhaps. A breath of change in the case, like the moment before a gust of wind scatters the first leaves. The night before, Mrs. Banbury's confession had confirmed more than it cleared. Yes, she had secrets. Yes, she had concealed what? Margaret Ellis had overheard all those years ago, but her fear of Felix Caro had been laced with something other than guilt, something more like shame. Now, as Miss Marple poured her tea and nibbled at a piece of toast, a sharp knock came at the door. It was Inspector Graves. He looked more rumpled than usual, his eyes bloodshot and his temper thin. "I'd appreciate your time, Miss Marple," he said without preamble. "Something's happened," she ushered him in and offered tea, which he declined with a grimace. "This morning, while cataloguing Mr. Caro's personal effects, one of my men found something troubling. It was slipped between pages of a book on his bedside table. A copy of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, if you can believe it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled momentarily, but she said nothing. Graves pulled a paper from his coat and handed it over. It was a photograph, creased, slightly faded. It showed a much younger Edith Banbury standing beside a woman with dark curls and bright eyes, a woman who looked suspiciously like Margaret Ellis. But there was something else in the photo. Standing just behind them, almost cropped out, was a young man with a familiar, narrow face. Miss Marple had seen that face before, recently. It was the grocer, Mr. Jenkins. "What's more," Graves continued, "there's handwriting on the back. Mr. Caro's, we believe. It reads, 'Taken at Thornfield, 1947. Jenkins, Ellis's brother.'" Miss Marple felt the final piece fall into place. Not yet the whole puzzle, but one edge clicking sharply into another. "Mr. Jenkins told everyone he came here after the war," she murmured, "but he's always been vague about where he was before." Graves nodded. "We questioned him this morning. He claimed no knowledge of the photo. Said he'd never met Margaret Ellis. But I have a constable digging into the records, birth certificates, war service rolls. If they're siblings, or even cousins, it changes everything." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Yes," she said, softly. "It does." Mr. Carrow had been investigating a decades-old mystery and had gotten too close. But what if the murder wasn't to protect a scandal, but to silence someone who'd already uncovered one? That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the grocer's. Mr. Jenkins stood behind the till arranging a crate of apples with mechanical precision. He looked up and forced a smile. "Miss Marple, lovely day." "Indeed. I do hope your wife is well?" "As always. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple placed her gloves gently on the counter. "I was just thinking about family, Mr. Jenkins. It occurred to me that people often hide the truth about their families not out of shame, but out of pain." His hands stilled. "Beg pardon? You see, it's perfectly natural to avoid questions when someone close to you has met a tragic end, especially if you've had to live among those who may have contributed to it." Jenkins's smile faded. "I don't know what you're implying." "Miss Marple," she leaned in, voice quiet. "You came here under a different name, didn't you? After Margaret's death, after she drowned. But it wasn't an accident, was it?" His jaw clenched, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might lash out. But he didn't. Instead, he looked away. "She was my sister," he said at last, his voice brittle. "Half-sister, if you want to be technical. We had the same mother, but no one knew, not here. Margaret kept it secret because she worked for them, the Banburys." "And what happened?" "She wrote to me," he said bitterly. "Said she'd overheard something important, said she was scared. But by the time I got here, she was already dead. They called it an accident, but I knew. I knew someone. Had wanted her gone." "You changed your name, stayed in the village?" He nodded. "Watched, waited, for years, nothing. Then Carrow arrived. He stirred things up. Came to me. Said he'd traced Margaret's last letters, said he thought he could prove it wasn't an accident." "And you helped him?" "I gave him what I had, the letters, the photo, everything I'd kept." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inside her thoughts were moving like clockwork. If Jenkins had given Carrow everything, he had no reason to kill him unless, "Mr. Jenkins," she said gently, "what exactly did Carrow do with what you gave him?" He looked confused. "He said he was going to confront someone, that it was time to force the truth. That evening, the day before the party, he was very sure of himself. And the next day, he was dead." Jenkins swallowed. "You think I killed him?" "I think," she said softly, "that someone else knew about your connection to Margaret. Someone who saw you speaking with him. Someone who felt threatened." She left without another word, but she felt it now, the shape of the truth coalescing. Someone had watched Mr. Carrow, followed his progress. Someone who'd feared what he might reveal and had made sure he couldn't reveal it. She walked to the rectory, where she found Reverend Mayhew pruning roses. "Miss Marple," he said cheerfully, "I was just thinking of you." "How serendipitous," she said. "Have you any idea who Margaret Ellis might have been related to? I've discovered something intriguing." The Reverend's clippers stopped mid-air. "Margaret Ellis? Good heavens, that name again?" "Yes, I'm beginning to believe her death was not accidental." He shook his head. "There were whispers at the time, but the coroner ruled—" "Sometimes, my dear Reverend," Miss Marple said gently, "it's not the coroner who gets the final say. It's the person who can connect the smallest forgotten clue." He frowned. "You sound as though you're nearly there." "Almost," she said. She paused at the gate and added, "And did you know that Mr. Jenkins is not who he says he is? The—" Reverend blinked. "Jenkins, the grocer? He's lived here for decades. Names are easy to change, faces less so." She left him puzzled and returned home as twilight began to descend. She now knew 4 things with certainty. Margaret Ellis had discovered a dangerous truth. Someone in the village had silenced her. Mr. Carrow had come close to revealing it and was silenced in turn, and the teacup used to poison him had been set aside deliberately. Who had known which cup he would use? Miss Marple sat in her parlour, eyes fixed on the fire, lips pursed in thought. Then she picked up her telephone and called Inspector Graves. "I believe I may have a suggestion," she said, "for how we might catch the murderer. But it will require a small gathering and a great deal of tea." Sunday morning was clear-skied and strangely warm for October. The village, though still wrapped in the gentle hush of unease, had begun to return to its routines. Bunting fluttered half-heartedly from the churchyard fence, and the bell rang out for morning service, as though death had not touched the lane only days before. Miss Marple, dressed in a lavender cardigan and a crisp white blouse, sat at her writing desk with a tray of buttered toast and a pot of assam. She had slept very little, but she looked rested. The moment had come, not for confrontation, but for confirmation. For Miss Marple knew the truth of it now. Or nearly. And she also knew, as she always did, that the best way to catch a guilty conscience was not to accuse it, but to observe it. That afternoon, she invited 6 people to tea. The invitations were written on her usual pale pink notepaper in her familiar, old-fashioned hand. She worded them casually, almost carelessly. "Do drop by for a quiet cup and slice, weather permitting. No mention of investigations. No mention of death, only polite expectation." Her guests included Mrs. Edith Banbury, Mrs. Flora Humphreys, Miss Felicity Mayhew, Mr. Jenkins the grocer, Emily Drayton, and at Miss Marple's gentle insistence, Inspector Graves, who had grumbled but arrived, muttering something about psychological tricks and village theatrics. They arrived at 4 precisely, each one looking uncertain, perhaps even suspicious. Only Mrs. Banbury managed a brittle smile. Mr. Jenkins looked pale. Miss Felicity seemed tightly wound as a coiled spring. Miss Marple greeted them warmly, her parlour already laid out with lace, bone china, and an assortment of cakes, lemon sponge, Dundee, and walnut. But it was the tea tray that held her attention. 6 cups, 6 saucers, 6 silver teaspoons, and a 7th cup, slightly mismatched, with a barely noticeable chip on the rim. She poured the tea herself. One by one, she offered each guest their cup, smiling, chatting lightly, until she came to the chipped cup. She hesitated, held it aloft for a moment, then turned to Mr. Jenkins. "Oh, would you mind terribly taking this one? It's a bit blemished, but I've so few left of this set." There was a slight pause. Mr. Jenkins's eyes darted to the cup. Then, how quickly away, he opened his mouth, closed it, reached for it and stopped. "Actually," he said, "perhaps Miss Drayton should take that one. I'm quite partial to the larger-handled ones, you see." Emily blinked, startled. Miss Marple didn't react, she merely nodded and passed it along. Of course, but she had seen it, the hesitation, the flicker of panic, because Mr. Jenkins had recognized the cup, the same one used on the day of the murder, and it hadn't been an accident. He had selected it, placed it just so, ensuring it would reach Felix Carrow's hand, and now, unwittingly, he had given himself away. The tea continued without incident, though a tension simmered beneath the pleasantries. Miss Marple guided the conversation toward familiar local topics: the state of the WI's jam sales, the recent infestation of whitefly in the vicarage garden, the rather risque new novel someone had spotted in the library drop-box. But at one point she asked, "Do any of you remember the taste of the tea that afternoon at Mrs. Banbury's garden party?" Felicity looked confused. "You mean the blend?" No, the flavour. Some found it a bit bitter. I wonder if the water had been sitting too long." Mr. Jenkins flinched, ever so slightly. Miss Marple noted it. A few moments later, she glanced at the inspector and offered him a signal, one she'd used before in their strange symbiotic relationship. A subtle nod that said, "You have what you need." After the guests had departed, Inspector Graves remained behind. He didn't sit. He stood with his hands behind his back, rocking slightly on his heels. "Well," he said finally. Miss Marple sighed, her tone almost mournful. "It's always so sad, isn't it? The end of the story. When the truth finally comes into the light and ruins what's left of the shadows." He folded his arms. "It was Jenkins," she nodded. "Oh, yes. He's Margaret Ellis's half-brother, though he never admitted it. I believe he came here under another name, perhaps after some minor trouble in London. Margaret's employment with the Banburys gave him a reason to stay nearby, quietly watching. And then Caro arrived." Mr. Caro's questions must have felt like a miracle to Jenkins, proof that he hadn't been wrong all these years, that someone else believed his sister had been silenced. But Jenkins also saw what Caro didn't, how dangerous it was to stir the past, not just for the Banburys, but for himself. Graves frowned. Why would Jenkins kill the one man trying to help him? Because Caro had begun asking too many questions, and not just about Margaret. He wanted to know who had provided him with the evidence. He was careless. He threatened. To name his source. She looked up, her eyes sorrowful. If Caro had exposed Jenkins's identity, the village would have turned. His business, his standing, all built on a lie. And perhaps Jenkins feared he would be blamed for Margaret's death all over again. Better, he thought, to end the story now, with poison. Graves shook his head slowly. "And the cup?" He set it aside in advance. He knew the order of service, knew Elsie would serve left to right. He made sure Caro's cup, the poisoned one, was in that place. "And today?" "He refused to take the same cup," Miss Marple said. "Not because it was chipped, but because he remembered. That small detail, a moment of instinct, revealed what words would not." The inspector nodded, grim. "We'll bring him in." Quietly. Miss Marple looked away to the window where the sun was slipping behind the oaks, bathing the village in an amber hush. "Let him walk home first," she said gently. "Let him have one last moment of quiet." Graves said nothing. Then he tipped his hat and left. Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, the tea tray still warm beside her. The shadows lengthened. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn. A dog barked in the distance, and within the span of 6 delicate teacups, murder had revealed itself. She picked up her knitting and resumed the slow, deliberate movements of her needles. There was still Section 9 ahead, the reveal, the part where all threads come together. But for now she allowed herself a moment of stillness. A life had been taken. Another would now be ruined. She did not take satisfaction in it, only quiet, understanding. It was not in Miss Marple's nature to gloat, nor was she one for dramatic speeches. She believed in quiet truths, gently delivered. But when Inspector Graves asked her to attend the final gathering at Thornfield House, ostensibly to clarify a few final matters, she agreed with characteristic modesty. "I should think it may help," she said, folding a shawl over her arm. "It's often easier to see a storm's path once the sky has cleared." The inspector had arranged for the key parties to be present. Mrs. Banbury, pale and composed, wearing the same pearl brooch she had worn the day of the garden party. Mrs. Humphreys sitting stiffly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Miss Felicity Mayhew visibly anxious, her eyes flitting between faces. Mr. Jenkins, the grocer, who had been fetched that morning under the polite but firm pretense of assisting with final details, and Emily Drayton, who had been invited by Miss Marple herself. "Moral clarity often needs witnesses," she had said. The setting was the drawing-room, where not 1 week earlier Felix Caro had been found dead. The same tea tray sat upon the sideboard, the same lace doilies neatly laid on the table. The illusion of comfort was as complete as it was deceptive. Inspector Graves opened the proceedings with a few dry remarks. "We've concluded our forensic and document analysis," he said, "and it is now evident that the teacup Mr. Carow drank from was tampered with. Arsenic enough to kill quickly and quietly. The delivery method was deliberate, it was not a random act." He paused, looked across the room, then turned to Miss Marple. "If you would, Miss Marple." She stood, her expression mild, almost apologetic. "I hope you'll forgive me if I speak plainly," she said. "It's never pleasant, these things. But sometimes truth, like prussic acid, must be administered swiftly." A strained silence. "Mr. Carow," she began, "was not simply a solicitor seeking rest. He came to St. Just in the Wold with a question. He wanted to know why a girl, Margaret Ellis, had drowned in the river in 1948. He believed she had been silenced after discovering something, and he was right." Mrs. Banbury flinched. Felicity looked down at her hands. Margaret overheard. An argument, not between Mrs. Banbury and her sister, as some suspected, but between another member of the household and Margaret herself. She was threatened. She wrote as much in her final letter. Miss Marple glanced at Emily Drayton, who gave a single grave nod. She was frightened. She confided in her half-brother, though few knew of him. He came to the village under a new, named Jenkins. He watched for years, waited. Mr. Jenkins, still and pale, gave no reaction. Then came Mr. Carow. He stirred old embers, asked the right questions. Mr. Jenkins saw in him a chance to finally reveal the truth about Margaret. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Banbury. "But you had your own secrets, didn't you, Edith? You feared scandal. You feared what would come out. And you shared your fears with the only person you truly trusted." Mrs. Banbury looked at her housekeeper. "Mrs. Humphreys," Miss Marple said gently, "you didn't poison Mr. Carow, but I believe you knew someone had, or suspected it. At the very least." Mrs. Humphreys trembled but said nothing. Miss Marple turned finally to Mr. Jenkins. "You wanted justice, but you also feared exposure. If Carow named you, linked you to Margaret, the village would question your motives, your business, your standing. So you decided to end the search before it turned on you." Mr. Jenkins opened his mouth, then closed it again. Miss Marple continued. "You entered Thornfield House before the tea was served, perhaps under the guise of a delivery. You placed a cup, already laced with poison, into the serving set. You knew the serving pattern, knew Mr. Carow would receive it." "You have no proof," Jenkins said hoarsely. "Only the proof that matters," Miss Marple said gently. "Your reaction to the same chipped cup you used for Carow, your instinct to deflect it today. You gave yourself away, Mr. Jenkins, not with confession but with avoidance. That and a slip of handwriting. Your sister's letters contain your script, identical." Graves stepped forward. "We've already confirmed your service history and original surname, the photo from 1947. You lied, Mr. Jenkins, and you'll answer for it." Jenkins looked around the room. No one spoke. Even Mrs. Banbury, her eyes wide with some mixture of disbelief and pity, remained silent. Finally he said, "She was my sister. I only ever wanted the truth, and when he came here I thought he would help. But Carow wasn't noble, he wasn't seeking justice, he wanted to sell the story. He threatened to publish everything unless I paid him to stay quiet. Said the scandal would drive my shop into ruin." "So you killed him," Miss Marple said, "to protect the image you'd built, the safety you'd carved for yourself in this village?" "Yes," Jenkins said, staring at his hands. "I did." Inspector Graves stepped forward, signaled the constable outside. There were no cries, no dramatics, only the soft shuffle of footsteps as Jenkins was led away. After he was gone, silence filled the room like smoke. Mrs. Humphreys finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I always thought I knew him. He came in every day for decades, always with a kind word." Miss Marple nodded. We all perform kindness, Mrs. Humphreys, but human nature, when pressed, will always reveal its truest self. Mrs. Banbury stood shakily. All these years, she said more to herself than anyone. Poor Margaret. I thought if I kept things quiet, if I buried it, but the truth has roots, doesn't it? Yes, Miss Marple said gently, and roots will always find the surface, no matter how deep the earth. She declined tea that afternoon. Instead, she walked home slowly, alone, letting the quiet speak. In the end, it had not been poison, nor motive, nor forensic evidence that solved the case, but a chipped teacup. A minor, seemingly unimportant detail, a single moment of hesitation, human nature laid bare. As she reached her gate, she paused to admire the final bloom of her roses, hardy and defiant in the autumn chill. Justice is never perfect, she murmured, but at least it blooms in season. She stepped inside, set the kettle to boil, and resumed her knitting. One more section remained, the aftermath, the quiet, and Miss Marple, as always, would meet it with composure. Miss Marple woke early on Monday, as she always did, and lit the stove with a precise hand. The news of Mr. Jenkins's arrest had already rippled through the village by then, thinly veiled in polite conversation at the post office and behind clipped greetings at the bakery. So dreadful, isn't it? They'd murmur, as if discussing a turn in the weather. But beneath it all lay something sharper, an unease that lingered like a bitter aftertaste. She had seen it before. Villages were like families. When a crime was solved, especially one born of long-buried grievances and quiet betrayals, the community didn't cheer. It flinched. Miss Marple didn't flinch. She gardened. She boiled eggs precisely 7 minutes. She greeted Mrs. Weatherby, who appeared at her gate with a bouquet of slightly wilted Michaelmas daisies, and a comment about how things like this never happened in my youth, which was patently untrue, but Miss Marple did not say so. I suppose we all like to imagine the world was safer when we were younger, she replied, but danger often hides in the same corners we think are safe. After Mrs. Weatherby left, Miss Marple received a quiet knock at her door. It was Emily Drayton, hands gloved, face pale. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, her voice thin, for listening, for believing what I remembered mattered. Miss Tay. Marple ushered her in and poured tea, letting the silence settle before speaking. It always matters, Emily. People assume murder is born in a moment of rage or madness. But more often it's the result of years of silence, the small truths ignored, the subtle warnings overlooked. Emily looked down at her cup. He seemed so ordinary. Mr. Jenkins, so dependable. Miss Marple stirred her tea. That's what made him dangerous. Not because he was evil, but because he believed he was right. Emily's eyes widened. You think he truly believed he was doing the right thing? I do. People commit terrible acts when they believe the world has failed them, and perhaps, in some ways, it had. But he didn't stop to consider who else he might destroy along the way. Emily left shortly after, her steps lighter than when she'd arrived. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard. The sun, low and buttery, filtered through the trees. She made her way to Margaret Ellis's grave, where someone, perhaps Jenkins himself, had placed a small bundle of violets in a chipped jar. She stood there a long moment, hands clasped gently in front of her. You were right to be afraid, she said softly, but not everyone turned away. She thought then of Mrs. Banbury, who had not left Thornfield House since the arrest. Miss Marple had received a note from her that morning, simple and handwritten in a slanted, delicate script. I was wrong to be silent. If ever you might visit, I would be grateful for your company. E.B., so she went. The house was dim and quiet when she arrived, though the drawing-room had been aired, and a fire burned low in the grate. Mrs. Banbury sat beside it, dressed more plainly than usual, her silver hair swept back in a loose knot. She looked older now, not worn exactly, but less composed. Stripped of her pride, she had grown human. "I've been thinking about Margaret," she said as Miss Marple settled beside her. "I let her down. I let myself believe the rumors, that she drank, that she was unstable. Easier than facing what she might have known." Miss Marple did not judge. "Sometimes our memories are softened by time to protect us." "She was a child," Mrs. Banbury whispered. "She trusted me, and when she died I buried my guilt along with her." Miss Marple touched her hand. "You were not the only one who failed her, but you were the only one who asked for forgiveness." "Mrs. Banbury nodded, blinking fast. "I've asked Reverend Mayhew to arrange a proper memorial for her, something modest, a plaque perhaps, and a place in the chapel's prayer book." She would have liked that. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that only grows between two people who have acknowledged something raw and difficult and chosen not to look away. Miss Marple stayed until the fire died down. By the following day, the village had resumed its routines in earnest. The Women's Institute met to discuss Christmas preparations. Mr. Peebles began repairing the fence outside the rectory. Even the tea-room reopened with a new batch of scones, subtly drier than before. But something had shifted in the air. There was a caution now, a carefulness in how people spoke to one another. The kind of change that lingers not because it's been enforced, but because it's been earned. Miss Marple returned to her garden, pruning the final roses before the frost. A robin flitted among the hedges. The sky was wide and pale. Felicity, Mayhew came by in the afternoon, cheeks pink from the cold. "I've decided to leave the village," she said suddenly. "For a while at least. There's a teaching position in Oxford. A friend recommended me." Miss Marple gave her a warm smile. "A fresh start?" "Yes. I loved this place once. I thought it was a haven. But maybe it's time I learned to live somewhere where I'm not so known." "That's not always a bad thing," Miss Marple said, "but I understand." Felicity reached out impulsively and hugged her. "Thank you." When she left, Miss Marple stood for a moment, hands clasped behind her back, gazing out over her little patch of earth. Murder had touched St. Justin the Wold, not loudly, not with grand gestures or twisted plots, but with the quiet malice that simmers beneath old secrets and unsaid words. And, as always, it was not the knife or the poison that had solved the crime. It was behavior, instinct, a single moment of hesitation over a chipped teacup. She went inside and sat down at her writing desk, making a small note in the corner of her diary. Justice, not always swift, but best served when no one is watching. Then she reached for her knitting. The needles clicked gently, the kettle whistled in the background, and outside life in the village moved forward, tentatively but steadily, as it always did, and Miss Marple, quietly and without fanfare, watched over it all. The trial of Harold Jenkins, formerly Henry Latham, came and went, with none of the fanfare that accompanies great city scandals. The papers gave it a column or two: village grocer guilty of poisoning retired solicitor. But St. Justin the Wold preferred to carry on as if nothing had happened at all. There were no banners, no grand pronouncements, no court artists, sketches hanging in the tea-room, but the villagers remembered quietly, deeply, and Miss Marple, as always, observed that memory was often the truest form of justice. Jenkins confessed, though only after evidence cornered him like a fox in a henhouse. He admitted to poisoning the teacup, selecting it in advance, ensuring it reached Felix Carrow's hands. He spoke of his sister's death with quiet fury and a belief that Carrow had become a threat rather than an ally. His solicitor had tried to suggest diminished capacity, but Miss Marple knew better. Jenkins had not been mad, only desperate. And desperation was one of the most dangerous conditions in which human nature could dwell. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. Mrs. Banbury gave a statement through her solicitor, and the village sighed with relief as the door to the affair creaked shut. But Miss Marple knew better than to think such things ended. In the weeks that followed, the air in the village softened. The roses in her garden finally gave way to frost, and the first whispers of winter curled around the eaves. A new grocer arrived from Downford, a polite, eager young man with a clean ledger and very little to say about the man who came before him. Business, like nature, abhorred a vacuum, Felicity Mayhew wrote from Oxford. Her letter was shy and hopeful. She liked the teaching post, she said. She was even attending lectures in philosophy and walking along the river with a young man from the antiquities department. I think you were right, she wrote. Some places teach you who you are, others help you become something new. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it among her correspondence with a fond smile. As for Mrs. Banbury, she remained at Thornfield House, though her world grew quieter. She no longer hosted garden parties. She cancelled her ladies' bridge circle indefinitely. But on Christmas Eve, she was seen placing a white rose on Margaret Ellis's grave, and those who watched said she did not cry, but she knelt there for a very long time. One bright January afternoon, Miss Marple received a visit from Inspector Graves, who had developed a habit of stopping by when his cases in Downford grew too dry. "You know," he said as they sat over tea, "you never told me when you knew it was Jenkins." Miss Marple sipped delicately. "I didn't know, not precisely, but when I saw his hesitation over the chipped cup, I recognized it. The kind of fear that's too quick to be faked." Graves nodded. "Still, risky. What if he hadn't reacted?" "Then I would have invited them all back for another round of tea," she said lightly. "Eventually someone would have revealed something. They always do." He smiled at that, not unkindly. "You never did explain one thing, though. Why lock the back door?" Miss Marple set her cup down because Jenkins needed time. After placing the poisoned cup, he left through the back to avoid suspicion. But he didn't want anyone else entering that way and interrupting what he'd planned. So he locked it, an unnatural act, which is precisely why it mattered. "Simple, when you put it like that," Graves muttered. "But it always is," she said almost to herself. "Once one understands people." The inspector left shortly after, and Miss Marple returned to her window seat. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, a light, clean dusting that softened the village lanes and tucked itself into every hedge and sill. St. Justin-the-Wold looked once again like a painting, peaceful, untouched. But peace, Miss Marple knew, was never the absence of danger. It was the delicate work of people choosing each day to live kindly, despite all they might know of the world. She picked up her knitting and resumed her shawl, rows of pale wool unfurling beneath her fingers. The kettle sang its familiar song. The fire crackled softly, and in the stillness of her parlour, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. There would be other storms in time. But for now the village slept, and the housekeeper who had locked the back door would no longer live under the shadow of suspicion. Justice had been done, not loudly, not cruelly, but with quiet certainty and the careful, steady hand of a woman who had spent a lifetime understanding what people are truly capable of. Miss Marple, as always, knew how to read the world not as it pretended to be, but as it truly was, and that, in the end, was all the mystery ever required.